Why don't we quickly segue over to Dr. Evian, who can just get under the hood, so to speak, and tell us about, the sort of developing adolescent mind. Why should we be concerned?
I think the book is really good, done a great job of outlining these four foundational harms that are succinctly distilled. And they clearly are really noteworthy. From a brain science point of view, these issues, the neural, as you know from our previous discussions on the brain, let's think of it from a actual brain point of view. Is 85 billion neurons, 100 trillion connections that are essentially dependent on validation and focus and task closure to get neural networks that fire together, wire together. They are so formative that to intrude on that process, this critical early phase process, is incredibly fragmenting. We could spend hours listing the combinatorial explosion of ways that disruption of this process is harmful. And there's no doubt about it. The fact of the matter is, though, that this is a new reality. And I want to just spend my few minutes on what is the other side of the coin of this. We know the problems, and we have the warnings, and we know that people are trying to limit and stop the kind of access. So here's the other reality of the brain. Firstly, when you tell people not to do something, the non-conscious brain, the first thing it does is now you've made that desirable, and especially in children. So there is no evidence that deprivation is either doable or desirable. So that's my first point. Just to finish on a second point, which is much more fundamental, which is about our sense of self, which is the main part of my counter contextual sharing about the neuroscience. Let's also just go through on the right-hand side of this slide, as the left-hand side was the summary of these, sort of foundational harms, as Jonathan was so powerful and always is powerful about highlighting in his writings, and fantastically good summarizer. But on the other hand, the neuroscience would totally support what he's saying. This constant stimulation is disruptive to the neuroplasticity. The dopamine release, when you are kind of reinforcing this addiction, gaming, is absolutely magnifying impulsivity. The fragmentation is very real. So now we've got neural networks that are not good at task closure, which is critical. He keeps repeating throughout the book and in his writings and in his webinars, videos, this issue of the disruption of critical and sustained thinking. And I want you to hold that thought for my final slide about, okay, this critical and sustained thinking, this great virtue that he somehow thinks that current children are getting, the perpetual stress absolutely being compounded. But I think the point that was made about abundance is really thoughtful. It is a world that has become more complicated, more people, more competitive. And so that is there independent of the access to social media. And clearly this arousal is very important. Most of you will have heard of the arousal curve that determines our performance. We each, as we're sitting here now, all of us, we each have a different level of arousal. And as I've mentioned when I went through my book, that the introverts are actually more aroused, the extroverts are less aroused, which is why they keep needing input to get more aroused. But that arousal is your rheostat for the brain, and it's very critical and very linked to your performance. If you do not get your arousal level correct, you're going to underperform one way or the other. So to have this disruptive arousal is a compounded effect to this distortion of the way the brain is sort of developmentally firing and wiring in the way that you kind of hope it would. And then lastly, there's all the social and loneliness and prioritization and delaying gratification issues that it results in. So all totally correct in terms of neuroscience disruption. But the point I want to end off on is just a slightly different one, which is all of this discussion is subserving a person's sense of self. And it turns out that kids have no idea what a sense of self is, even at 16. They are super sophisticated, incredibly intelligent, articulate. This is a pointer as to how we might be underestimating what these young brains are capable of. The fact of the matter is, though, it's very hard to get a sense of self. So people understand self-esteem because we know if we feel made to feel any of those things on that horrible list, it's not going to make us feel great. They're not going to make kids feel great. But this is also time for sense of self. And sense of self, and that there was, for those of you who saw it, I've circulated a neuroplasticity international community. I gave their annual meeting, and I gave the talk on sense of self. They used my brain model in their community. And so it highlighted this point for me in revisiting neuroplasticity, that most of these kids, let's look at what education they're currently getting. It's not that great in terms of critical skills and all these things that Jonathan Haidt kind of illuminates is being disrupted. How good is it in our current system? The system designed to support industrial complexes, that education, it's very wanting. And so what we see in the International Brain Database before smartphones is a tremendous amount of problems in kids. It may not be the same extent, and it's obviously been escalated, but these problems were there because of a very inadequate education. Kids don't understand the most basic things about attachment and the impact on their lives, about conditioning and how that affects them for the rest of their lives. It's the shadow that follows them forever. How they can learn effectively, critical thinking. These are not virtues that are well elucidated in the current system. So my final point is very simply this. I think AI offers an opportunity in smartphones in general and the access to this information. And that is to educate and empower children to another level. We now have the means to educate kids and you can limit what kids are exposed to on these phones. That is one thing that can be done. I think taking them away is wishful thinking because they're going to find them some way. But limiting what they get access to, or most importantly, and my final point, validating what I found is that over 40 years in the brain, there's only one thing people are really interested in, themselves. And when you make that information interesting enough to them, empowering enough to them, dopamine stimulating enough to them, they will go for it because their brains are not stupid. They want to have a sense of self. They want to be empowered. And so if the access and the tools are interesting enough, fun enough, they'll go for it. And so that's my prediction. That's my contrary view a little bit, although I do find the whole book fascinating and very critical. But I want to just end off on that point that this is a massive opportunity as well as a massive potential problem. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Beautiful, kind of balanced and critical overview. Thank you so much for that deep dive into how the brain works and how, what are the opportunities, or notwithstanding, the obvious problems. Beautifully framed it, Evian.